So welcome, everybody. Welcome, John. It's always amazing to have you on and have the pleasure of having a conversation with you.
Love it.
I hope everyone who watches our channel at this point is familiar with you. We've only had you on about a half a dozen times. So one would think they'd be familiar, but if anyone isn't, John is the director of cognitive science and a full professor now, right?
No, not a full professor, associate professor.
Associate professor. Okay.
Associate professor.
Associate professor. I get these.
I have tenure.
Confused.
Yeah.
You have tenure. At the University of Toronto, he is the author of a book called Zombies in Western Culture, co-author of that, and also the author of a YouTube series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which has been hugely influential to many people who pay attention to a lot of things we like to pay attention to. I was just rewatching elements of it this morning, and they were absolutely amazing. Anything else people should know about you, John, before we get started?
Let me see. I've got other series on there that are out there that I'd like to plug. There's Untangling the World Knot, which is about consciousness. There's The Elusive I, which is about the self. There's Towards a Metapsychology That is True to Transformation, which is about human development. These are all done with other people in a dialogical format, where I'm trying to exemplify the integration of theoretical argumentation and collaborative dialogue as a way of developing and affording ideas and building knowledge of if that's not too grandiose. So yeah, there's lots out there to take a look at.
Yeah, absolutely. You've put out an incredible body of work since you really started becoming a major YouTuber. It's hard to keep up with, but it's been incredibly informational and just deep. And of course, having had a chance to speak with you so often has been immensely influential for me. So thank you.
Well, I owe a lot to you. You're often my exemplary case of the emergent ecologies of practices that are directed towards alleviating the meaning crisis. So it's always a great honor to talk to you too.
Excellent. So today we wanted to really take on a specific theme, which is the idea of how mindfulness practices can help us better capture the insight generation and cultivation and skill transfer that we're looking for from our physical practices.
Yeah.
So we treat that as a bit of an axiom in our method. It's a priori, right? That this transfer is possible. But I think we should dig a little bit deeper into that question before we start kind of getting into the nuts and bolts of how we go forward with it. So the first thing I wanted to ask you as a cognitive scientist is, what do you understand about the research of how we actually see skill transfer between different domains?
Yeah. Well, so this is more of a question than an answer for me, which is why I appreciate having this discussion. This goes back to, I've told this story before. I think I've even told it to you about, I was doing Tai Chi Chuan. I'd been doing it for like 2 or 3 years. I was doing it very religiously in multiple meanings of that word.
Yeah.
And I was having all these flow experiences and amazing phenomenological things and all this. But it was when other people came up to me and said, "We've noticed a change in you. You're more balanced in how you're talking to people. You're more flexible in your thinking," that I realized that the Tai Chi Chuan was bleeding into my life in ways I wasn't noticing, but other people were noticing, and that had a huge impact on me. And then I compared that to, and I've had discussions with students, my students at the university, about people who get in, for example, into the flow state in certain video games, and it clearly doesn't transfer to their life. In fact, it does the opposite. They get the flow state within. I'm not claiming all video games do this. I'm not, but I'm saying this is the experience of some people with some video games. They get into the flow state, they get addicted, right? The WHO talks about this. They get locked into that world, and they get locked in an addictive way precisely because it doesn't transfer to their life in general. And then if those are sort of poles, the other thing that's intriguing me is, I think this relates to all kinds of enacted serious play. One critique one could make of some of the traditional world religions is that people are rejecting them not because of belief issues. I'm not saying that's not a case, but by and large, when you take a look at this, these people are rejecting the religions because of belonging issues. And I think what that translates into is not only the sense of being at home in the temple or the church, but also that what's going on in those places doesn't transfer to their life in a viable way. So this issue of transfer, I think, is paramount to the cultivation of wisdom and meaning. So this is, and so there's variations. There's lack of transfer, there's profound transfer, and then you can also get interference, which is negative transfer. You're trying to learn Wing Chun and the Tai Chi strike keeps getting in the way.
Yeah.
And we're all familiar with that. And that's one of the advantages of MMA is it helps you to break out of that and get to a higher order of sort of data compression going on. So those three things are all apparently like very well recognized in the literature, but there's not a lot on this specific issue. There's a general issue of what's called transfer appropriate processing and memory. Like, how do I process now in a way that's procedurally and perspectively and even participatorily similar enough to where I'm going to use it that it will transfer? All of this is being talked about, but this sort of focused question of, well, what's the difference between good transfer, no transfer, and bad transfer? Like, what that is not, I'm not aware of any good, now, I could be wrong, but I'm ignorant of any research that's specifically directed at trying to answer that question. But it's a question that I think is really important and fundamental right now. Asking the question, those sort of three interlocking questions: what drives good transfer? What is happening with bad transfer? And what's happening with no transfer?
Yeah. I recently had a conversation with Rob Gray, who I think he's the director of experimental psychology at ASU. And he works in the sort of ecological dynamics perspective. I really like to get you guys in dialogue as well. I think that'd be really
I would like that.
You know, we talked about an idea that's being promoted in the ecological dynamics world of parkour specifically as a donor sport. But it's more broadly, that idea of a donor sport is a broader concept, but they're specifically talking about how parkour might actually improve soccer playing as an example.
Yes.
And this comes out of Keith David's lab. So we know that there is, like, from a kind of experiential side, like, I have seen as a coach athletes who take adaptations from one sport and show up and have some sort of virtuosity from that in another sport. I've also seen athletes who really struggle, and sometimes it's the same athletes, right? So if you take a gymnast into parkour, he or she will learn a lot of acrobatics more easily than a general person. But one thing you might struggle to teach them is how to do a shoulder roll correctly, because they've done so many reps and they've been really conditioned about there's this, it's almost like a frame problem for gymnastics athletes. The frame that they've accepted intuitively, almost without realizing it, is that proper movement is always sagittal or frontal, and it's never, or transverse, but it's never mixed. You never go diagonally around something. And so it can be really, really hard to break them of the habit of tucking their head and looking at their belly when they're trying to do a roll.
Right.
I've seen, if you have somebody who comes from basketball over to parkour, I think they're going to be really good at jumping up and grabbing stuff, right? They're going to know how to organize themselves to do that. That's there's almost a one-to-one coupling there, right? Aside from like the visual perception of what you're jumping at. Athletes who come from Taekwondo spin really well. All right.
Yeah.
And so we see that there's this transfer of training. One of the assumptions we tend to make is that an athlete who's good at one thing is going to just be good at other things. And that's not the case. And Rob likes to talk about this famous case, and I've talked about this as well, but Jenny Finch, who is the world's best soft pitch or fast pitch softball player, or pitcher for a while. she was pitching, I think about 73, 74 miles per hour. So about 20 miles per hour less than like a standard Major League Baseball fastball. And she went around and challenged a bunch of major league hitters to hit her, and they get 3 chances to hit her, and nobody could touch the ball. They couldn't even get the bat on the ball. Albert Pujols, Barry Bonds, didn't matter.
Right.
And so this is an example where like we'd expect an almost direct one-to-one transfer, and then we find at least at the first iteration, there appears to be no transfer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, I've thought about this a lot, and what I've experienced is that oftentimes if I go to a sport that's somewhat similar to my sport but different, there's some movements that I can get right away, but once we get into more complex and specific movements, there's not a direct transfer on the first attempt. Like my first attempt is just as awkward and uncomfortable as the next guy's first attempt, but my 5th and 10th attempts are substantially better because my brain can start to recognize things that it can donate from previous experiences.
Yes. Yep.
So that's, and then, well, I could go on, but I'm gonna shift the ball back into your court. So why might we think of mindfulness as something that could actually improve our general ability to improve transfer between, I mean, we can look at, like, I think people, to me, there's a much deeper connection between like, can baseball make you better at softball, and can baseball make you better at life?
Yeah.
Right? You're just talking about sort of orders of domains, right? Or you're talking about domains and higher orders of the domains are within. So if we understand to some degree how it happens at that very local level, I think we can start scaffolding up insight that could help us understand how to access it at the higher level. Yeah. Like you said, with Tai Chi, you experienced a change in how you oriented in relationship to other people. And I was talking to my wife actually this morning about this. She has just picked up rock climbing again for the first time in several years. And she's finding it really rewarding. And she's literally noticing that her ability to access her breath and calm herself down, that she's picking up in her rock climbing, is she'll have this sense of like a problem arrives at work, and a ghost of that experience will kind of pop into her head and remind her that she can do better problem formulation if she calms herself down.
That's exactly right. Well, two things. First, we have to understand that this is not just at sort of the direct movement level. Sternberg famously did the example with bridge masters, people who are expert in bridge, and when they play with novices, they crush them, of course. And then he slightly changed the game, slightly changed all the rules, taught both sides, and invented a new game called Schmidge. And now the novices crush the experts. So, like, even in something as abstract and almost purely symbolic cards, right, you get the same issue. And so that points to something that I think we're moving towards, which is, and this is tricky. So we want to try and get the most domain general processes. These are the ones that are going to be presupposed in any domain, and therefore by improving them, they have the greatest chance of transfer. But we don't want these processes to be so simple that the transfer will only be simplistic, if I can put it that way. And so the trick is to get kind of a dynamic of grounding processes. And so one of the things that you get in a mindfulness practice is, hopefully you tap into the dynamics of attention and you learn how to improve, optimize the dynamics of attention. So you get something that's domain general. You're paying attention well, just as good almost wherever you're trying to do anything. But it's not a simplistic set of things like, focus my eyes or something like that. It's a much more complex system, so that when I can transfer this general skill, it gives me, a dynamic scaffold to get me going in the new domain. I don't know if that's making any sense, but what I'm saying is you want to get down to something that is shared by many domains, but you don't want to get down to something that's so basic that it's not going to offer you much to work with once you get there. Look, opening my eyes, really important no matter what I'm trying to do. There you go. Practice opening your eyes. Okay. Now we get it. That's general, but it's too simple. Do you see what I'm trying to get at?
Mm-hmm.
You want to get down to the general, but the general has enough meat in it. And if I can, maybe that's offending vegetarians. It has enough
body
content,
to it,
structure to it, that it will, it can give us momentum in the domain. There's a dynamic there that we can tap into when we get to new domain. Now, I think mindfulness, properly practiced, and I have criticisms a lot of the way the West has misappropriated mindfulness, trains us in the dynamics of attention. Attention is needed everywhere, but if we improve the dynamics, we're going to get a machine that's already complex and running, and they could give us some momentum wherever we go into a new domain. So I think that's why mindfulness is very, very important. There are other things that are like that, but mindfulness is importantly one of them, I would say.
Yeah. So I guess there was a couple ideas that I heard in there that I wanted to echo back and amplify. One is this idea of how do we attune really attention to higher order of control, and not just attention's almost an incomplete way of thinking about it. It's kind of like, I want to come back to that because I feel like there's something missing in framing it as attention. But Franz Bosch is one of my favorite thinkers in the kind of dynamical systems approach to motor control. Yeah. He talks about this idea that you want to have high variability in training. And this is really congruent, obviously, with the evolvable play method, because what it does is expose you to a sufficient set of problems that you get a better search space for the type of motor control strategies that apply in many situations.
Exactly.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
So you can imagine that, throwing a punch has maybe 10 factors that you start to tune into that allow you to be successful. Yeah. And then throwing a baseball also has 10 factors that allow you to be successful. And then it turns out that 3 of those factors are shared by both.
Yeah.
And the athlete who's done both now has the ability to prioritize those 3 factors, which allows them to better distribute their attention and to then notice that thing in the next related activity that they're in. So the more variable your training in some sense is, though I'm sure there's also there's a point where that doesn't work either. You have to have a balance, right? But there's an optimal level of variation that allows you to extract higher order principles.
Right. So you need, and this is exactly where I wanted to go in the next move. Yeah. So you actually facilitated it. So first of all, I'm going to make a distinction that's becoming important in the philosophy of biology between the evolution of a trait and the evolution of evolvability.
Yep. So
one way you can win competition is you evolve a particular a suite of traits. Mm-hmm. And that's a viable strategy in evolution. But another strategy organisms can adopt, I'm sorry, this makes it sound like they're consciously choosing, and that's all wrong, but that's the way the language is forcing me to talk, right? That you can evolve your evolvability. You can evolve your ability to evolve.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think you've got half of the engine. You want to increase your variation, but you want to get a very generalizable, but again, not necessarily simplistic principle of selection as well. Because the problem you can get is things can overlap in a way that's useless. right, that can, wow, these overlap, and I like there's many ways. So if we think about these as very complex structures, there's many ways in which they have the potential to overlap. And so we have the variation, but we also want to make sure that the selective principles we're putting on it are going to be very powerful and highly generalizable. This is, of course, how evolution works, right? And so you want to get a variation, but you also want to make sure you're very careful in selecting your principle of selection. And what is it going to be? Because that's going to affect what emerges. But what you can do, right? And this is where it gets, this is like the Karst thing of moving from the finite to the infinite game, is you can start to say, but I can adopt the meta strategy of trying different virtual engines. So I'm not just going to be evolving traits, putting them into competition. I'm going to have this selection and this variation, this selection and this, you know what I'm saying? And then I do a bigger, so I do a virtual engine of virtual engineering kind of thing. The model I have for something like that is philosophy as a practice, right? So what you do is you're in epistemology and you're doing this, you're in metaphysics and you're doing this, right? And you're in ethics and you're doing this, but you're also putting all of those into a huge selection and variation machine. So you do here's the different theories in ethics, and here's the selection, which is going to lead to the best life. Here's the best, right? Here's all the here's the variation ontology, what's the best account of reality, and here's the selection we're going to put on it. Good argumentation, good evidence. Here's the best, and so on and so on. But then what you can do is you can step out and say, but what is it to do that well in each one of those? What is it like to do philosophy in each one? Is that working as an analogy for you?
I think so. I want to, for me, I'm comfortable in the grounds of sort of biology and like motor control and movement skills. So I'm going to try to kind of to scaffold up from that. So what occurred to me when you talked about evolvability is actually that I believe that there's been research that shows that there's something specific about dogs relative to cats in particular that allows them to shift their morphology faster under selection.
It has something to do with solving the robustness paradox. And what it's talked about is what's called, I don't like this term, it's called degeneracy. So what you want, you want a lot of overlapping redundancy in your genotype that doesn't usually result in specific important differences in your phenotype. Mm-hmm. But if the environment changes, it gives you the reserve there that you can then focus on, so you can get the phenotypical variation that you need. You don't want lots of phenotypical variation all the time because you'll die. Yep. Right, that's the robustness paradox. So you want to get a lot of variation genotypically and the way you do that is have a lot of overlapping redundancy. You don't have complete homogeneity, and you don't have complete segregation. And this is relevant to what we're talking about now.
Absolutely. So we're going to come back to degeneracy because that was a big part of my conversation with Rob Gray as well, and it's very important to understand. But so just to ground it for the audience, right? Like, that there are an immense variety of dog breeds, right? Yeah. And that they range in size from teacup poodles who are a couple pounds to, Kangals, which are, can be up to 200 pounds, right?
Irish Wolfhounds.
Yeah. 36 inches of the shoulder, heads that are huge and wide and thick and short and popped out and all these things. And now there's a lot more variations of cat breeds than there used to be. And part of this also has to do with the functional way in which we've used dogs versus how we've used cats. We've selected dogs for a much broader variety of functions.
And the more time we've been selecting on them longer. Yeah.
Yeah. But even if you look at their wild analogs, wolves and dogs seem to be a particularly plastic species, right?
Yes.
The variation among the wild cats that are closely related to the cats that we own they're pretty similar from one place to another. But the largest subspecies of wolves are 130 pounds maybe. The smallest subspecies of wolves are like 35 pounds.
Yeah.
They vary immensely in the size of their heads, right, and how robust their head are. And if we go back, like the evolutionary biology of canids is really fascinating. Like, it used to be that we thought the gray wolf was the direct ancestor of the dog. But what it looks more like now is that there was a lot of closely related species of wolf-like canids that existed that kind of collapsed at the end of the last ice age, or around that period. And some of those lineages coalesced into what became wolves, and one of those lineages became dogs. But like, coyotes and wolves are only separated, according to the most recent research, by about 50,000 years of evolution. Which is, they've differentiated in niches and overlap each other, and can be sympatric and not interbreed. And that happened kind of in an evolutionary eye blink. So there's something about that. So the canid genome seems to maybe have evolved with a greater degree of this idea of degeneracy. And so let's talk about that, because they use the same term in Ecological Dynamics in reference to motor skills, right? A better athlete has higher motor degeneracy, which means that they have more redundant strategies to achieve the same effect.
Well, they get an optimal balance between redundancy and differentiation. That's what degeneracy is trying to get at. Okay. And you're right. I think this linkage is good. And what you're pointing to, by the way, is that the dogs are sort of higher in evolvability than cats.
Exactly.
Which means long term, the dogs are going to win, given the variation in the environment. So yeah, and that's exactly what I wanted to get at. I was trying to do that with the philosophical example, but I get it. You're right. That's too highfalutin. Yeah. So although I think
it's beautiful to connect it, but I think that by giving it a specific, by being able to reframe it in my frame, I think it helps the students. I think it's useful to hear your frame as well.
Well, and what I would hope for is ultimately a degeneracy between the philosophy and the movement. The gymnasium and the academy are right beside each other, right?
They are the same, right? Originally, the academy was a gymnasia.
Yeah, exactly.
And the dialogues start there.
Yes. So that's what I was trying to get at. I was trying to get at, right? You want basically that overlap. The problem is we don't think of the overlap just as a line, right? Which we're tempted to do, but you have to think about it sort of as a multi-dimensional overlap. Mm-hmm. So like things are overlapping in multiple dimensions. You want to get this, and you get this at the functional level. The work that Kelso's done on what's called metastability, which is brain states that are in parallel doing integration and segregation. And that has a lot to do with relevance realization. So if you got at the firing level, you want you want to get into this you want to get metastability, which is different than what's often thought about people trying to get stability. Like this is get into this sort of structure of skills and then stay there. You want metastability. But you want a degeneracy. See, I don't like the term because people are hearing this and they're thinking of things.
I think Turvey has I think it's Turvey who's proposed that in motor control it be referred to as abundance. It's motor abundance, but it's generally in the literature referred to as motor degeneracy, which just sounds like getting worse at movement.
For example, and that's what it sounds. And when you encounter it in biology, people of course get Spencerian ideas of evolution. Degeneracy, they're becoming degenerate. What? But the idea is, the way I like to think about it is it solves the robustness paradox. The robustness paradox is the species needs variation in order to evolve, but the individual doesn't want to be one of the variants because it's most liable to die off. So how do you get the best balance within organisms, right? And the idea is, as we said, you want this degeneracy in the genotype. And so it's not just, there's sort of three prongs to the definition. You want this optimal balance between overlap and differentiation, but there's also the relationship to the world, which means most of the time it's not expressing a wide variation in behavior, because that's dangerous, right?
Yeah.
And so what it needs to do is, but what it gives you is, it gives you this reserve that you can activate when needed to produce variation on demand, kind of like print on demand. You can produce variation on demand. Is that making sense?
It does. I wanted to go, let's go back a step, because there's something I wanted to get at, because I think you touched on it and I think it's important. You were talking about the idea, it's not enough to have variation, right? Because essentially variation, if you're trying to become a more skillful, more wise, more virtuous human being, just doing a bunch of stuff isn't going to get you there.
Yeah, you'll be a dilettante.
Yeah, and it's the same thing. Like if you want to become a skillful mover of any kind, if you want to be a skillful basketball player, just trying out as many different types of shots as possible will not work.
That's right.
Right. So there's if we use the analogy of evolution again, which I think is beautiful, we're missing the selection aspect.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So mutation provides variation for the evolutionary grist, along with sexual reproduction. Right. And then selection is what attunes that variation to the specific environmental constraints.
Exactly.
So essentially what competition in sport is a kind of selection criteria, right? Or application. What you're doing is you have an extinction criteria.
Very good.
Yeah, this approach, this thing doesn't work. And like within motor control, like kind of looking at motor control, there's two forms of variation. There's variation that supports performance and variation that moves us away from performance. Right. So negative and positive variation. So as we grow as movers, what we're looking for is to harvest all of the positive variation possible while eliminating the negative variation. So if we were to change the constraints of a basketball game such that you couldn't miss a shot, then we wouldn't get any information about the difference between the positive and negative variation. On the flip side, if we change the constraints to make them too difficult, we also don't get any information. That's because right. Every strategy fails, even strategies that might be more effective, right? Their marginal more effectiveness isn't clear when the landscape is too difficult. There's actually one of the things that I think we have a problem with right now, which is the landscape is changing so fast that it's making it harder and harder for us to be aware of the strategies that are actually long-term successful.
Yes,
but that's a kind of we're jumping orders of magnitude, or we're jumping levels of analysis from motor control to what's the problem in the meta crisis. So maybe let's not go all the way deep into the meta crisis.
At one point, I do want to go there, because that is again the connection between the philosophical level and the embodied level. Because I want to pose a problem, which is I agree. I thought what you just did there was brilliant.
Thank you.
We use competition as the selection, but I want to be able to to have other people what happened to me and what happened to Beth, right? I want that kind of transfer as well, and right. I'm getting it, and I have something I want to say, but I want to let you keep going for a second. Well, all I want to say is, again, I want to move from the finite game to the infinite game. I want to be able to be like the Wisconsin sorting task. I want to be able to shuffle the selection criteria as well, so that I can improve the kinds of transfer, because that again is going to make me more evolvable rather than just driving specific traits that have been evolved.
Yeah. So the problem with so let's say we've identified that we need to explore variation while having selection criteria, right?
Right.
And this is you could say this is how you become a better mover, but there's also how you become a better thinker, because you've talked a lot about how we have to have a balance between active open-mindedness and critical thinking.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Active open-mindedness is intentionally exposing yourself to things that are outside of the way that you would normally think about something. And critical thinking is being able to apply some kind of exclusion criteria so that you can sort through what's actually useful of that and what's not.
Sure.
Right? Or as Bruce Lee would say, absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, add what's uniquely your own, right? Like, there's many ways of pointing to this thing. So, but once we impose the selection criteria, the problem is that we can be pointing at the wrong problem formulation.
Yeah.
Right. So, if you're like, and we see this in martial arts, right? Like martial arts is a beautiful kind of exemplar of this. So we have martial arts that have no extinction criteria. So they don't have any form of alive selection.
Yeah.
And what we see over time, and you can track this, is they become more aesthetic and formal and flourishy, right? And less functional. So if you look at stances in karate, in formed and karate forms in kata from 1912, right? You'll see that they look much more like the type of stances that you actually see people use in MMA than the types of things that show up in kata now. And you can see that it's slowly evolved to a deeper, longer, more exaggerated stance. It's actually, we can even go back to dogs, right? So if you use a dog to hunt pigs, you'll discover that you want a dog with a big, heavy, thick head, right? That gives massive power and biting and stopping force.
Right.
If you take away the selection criteria of actually breeding such a dog, people start thinking bigger heads is better, right? And maybe a shorter jaw.
Yep.
And all of a sudden you have dogs who are deeply unhealthy who can't fulfill function at all.
Yes. Good
Right?
analogy.
Yeah.
Good.
So we have that problem, but then the other problem is that, let's say that your goal is the original purpose of the dog is pig hunting. The original purpose of karate is self-defense. Yeah. Now you're not getting enough exposure to it, right? Maybe there's no pigs in your area. So you do schutzhund, you do bite sport, but it turns out that actually the characteristics that make a successful schutzhund dog are not that related to the characteristics that make them a good boar hunting dog. So Olympic Taekwondo actually selects for learning how not to hit someone hard, which is a very bad habit to have as a fighter. You can take things that you've learned in Olympic Taekwondo and you can donate them to an effective martial art, but it requires a lot of unlearning as well. So we have the problem of no selection, and then we have the problem of inappropriate selection.
Yes.
And then the issue with martial arts is that violence is such a vast and it's impossible for anyone to have, and it's also so high cost, right? It's one of those things in which you enter into the arena in which you're going to get the most valid feedback is to rapidly just instinctify yourself.
Yeah.
Right?
And you can also get into the problem we talked about being, phenotypically inappropriate.
Yeah.
Right. Like let me just briefly say, like, if the driving reason why I did Tai Chi Chuan was self-defense, I'm a fool, because the number of times I've had to actually defend myself is very small in number. Yeah. It might grow given the way things are going. I don't know. But the point is, right, if that was my reason, then I've wasted a huge amount of time and a lot of learning space, right? And so while it's important to know the self-defense function, because you can't correct the form unless you know what the intended function is, I was always pursuing it for something else.
Yes.
I was always pursuing it according to different selection criteria. And part of that was implicit and then explicated by that experience I related to you.
Mhm.
And then part of it was, a reflective choice. I was looking for Socrates in the academy and it wasn't there. And I started looking for Socrates by taking up Tai Chi Chuan and mindfulness practice. And here's not to be self-promotional, but I think that's how we should be doing for people in general, right? I think one of the problems with a lot of the martial arts, although there are people like Rachel Hayden who are trying to move away from this, is the hyper focus on self-defense. That is an important skill. I'm not denying that. But for many people, if that's all they're getting out of it, and I mean this very carefully, they're wasting their time, right? Yeah. Because like some people, imagine being a Kung Fu master. And I'm saying, but if I'm a Kung Fu master and I've taken all that time to do this, and I might fight 3 times in my life, and all that space could have gone towards making me a more virtuous, more caring person, a person more capable of being rational. Have I made a good decision overall? Right? I'm not trying to do special pleading. I'm trying to say, like, I think that's what I was trying to do with the virtual engine on the virtual engines. We need something higher, in which a higher arena in which we're playing around with the selection criteria. That's what I was trying to put my finger on.
I mean, that's absolutely what I think of evolvement play as. Like, that's the
exactly.
We're trying to orient toward the kind of the highest order self-cultivation that we can.
Yes.
But we want to do it in a way that respects, like, that the self-defense thing is actually it's like maybe the wrong religion, but it's a powerful tool.
Yeah.
And if you the thing I have a lot, with a lot of like Tai Chi is, like, people think that they learned to fight and they didn't. And it's like, we need to be more realistic about what it is. But also, it's like, the way that I see it is that there's a type of lesson you can only learn through that type of selection that goes into the real fighting. Right.
Yes.
And so it's like the grounds for potential self-cultivation are stronger in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu than they are for me in like Aikido or Tai Chi. But then a lot of times it's not utilized. It's like the higher order is then not recognized because the lower order.
That's excellent. That was good. I'm not that you haven't said good things up to now. That was an indirect insult. That was good what you just did. Right. It's almost like there's some sort of weird attractor there. Mm-hmm. The things that have the greater capacity for, let's call it character cultivation, just to put a name on it for now, right, are also the ones that tend to be tempted to be, what I call the kick and punch schools, right, where you're really good at kicking and punching, and you could fight your way, you could defend yourself against 2 unarmed opponents, and it's like, yeah, great. Are you a good person? Right? Yeah. Are you a good person?
Train the human first. So so it's like when we need a lower order selection criteria that's meaningful in order to start to be able to see and scaffold up from that.
Yep.
And when we miss that, we very easily start going into these self-delusional things.
Yes.
But what's revealed at that lower order, it can be sufficiently fascinating to keep you there without actually delivering the changes that are most relevant. Like, I always think about this in reference to self-defense. It's like, I've been to these self-defense, like all these guys who are really serious about self-defense. They're training for violence. They think about violence. They talk about violence all the time. And they're overweight, and they walk outside in their army fatigues and smoke cigarettes on their breaks between training self-defense.
Yes.
It's like, okay, well, what is more likely, that you will be assaulted and killed, or that you will die of cancer?
Exactly.
Right? I always tell people the most important self-defense, important self-defense thing you can train yourself in is not texting and driving, and not drinking and driving.
Well, let me pick up on that and say one thing. Look at the statistics of violence. Who is most likely to assault you? Family and friends in an informal situation. Parties, Christmas parties are very dangerous places. No, statistically.
No, I get it. Yeah, I get it. It's just
really dangerous, right? And so, like, the skills that would manage me in that situation so it doesn't ever get to violence are really going to be better for my longevity than what if you're jumped from behind on the street? Well, yeah, I get that. But what's much more likely that a loved family member will kill me in a moment of emotional trauma and rage.
Yeah.
Right. And so dealing with that is actually, again, in the broader picture, a better kind of self-defense. Right. Like if you pay attention to the typical arenas of violence, you think like chances are like, and I know somebody personally, like great martial artist, right? But, because of a family connection, he couldn't defend himself against violence, not because he didn't have the skill.
Mm-hmm.
He could have devastated the other person, but because there was a familial relation, he was subject to abuse.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I've seen this. It's interesting. We're actually playing a lot with the idea that, Jordan Peterson has talked about the game and the meta game.
Very much. I've always told Jordan, I've told him in person that this is one of his best arguments.
Yes. The game and the meta game. So, but what I see in the martial arts in particular is that the people who focus on the meta game, they delude themselves into the nature of the game that they're playing at the local level.
I don't deny that. None of what I'm saying denies that. There's too much woo. There's too much. Tai Chi is particularly guilty of this.
Yeah.
I admit that. I admit this.
I'm not trying to like trap you in that. I'm just trying to say, well, how do we understand that? Like it may be a kind of domain specific thing to martial arts in some way, because of the nature of the thing they're trying to train is actually so difficult to get at in a realistic way that's also sustainable.
Yeah.
And so the search space for optimizing that training is really difficult. And so it's easy for people to get kind of like adopt these delusional things. But I think it may be but it is a broader problem that we're talking about, which is how do we move from, what we're really talking about is how do we move from kind of lower order optimization towards higher order optimization. And in some sense, part of what you have to do is attend to the lower order.
Yes.
Right. And you've talked about this. We have to be bottom up and top down. So to invoke Peterson again, one of the things that he talks about is like, if you want to have a romantic relationship with your spouse, one of the best things you can do is get really good at handling the mundane parts of your relationship, because they're like 80% of your relationship. So if you can just dial that stuff in, then it actually makes room for you to have the romantic side. So if you're always fighting about who does the dishes, who does the laundry, then then there's no time to be romantic with each other. But if you dial that in, if you get the 80% right, then it makes room for the 20% that gives the richness to the relationship. But I'm going to say this because I think this is funny. Like Beth and I have actually recently just started talking to a marriage counselor just to, help grow our relationship and everything. And he's saying the opposite to us. He said, you guys have spent so much time focusing on these logistics that you're not focusing on the strengths and warmth in your relationship. And it's like getting a 5% more improvement over there isn't going to do it. You actually have to change what you're framing and focusing on in order to get the transformation. So you do need this kind of lower order taking care of the logistics of actually being able to defend yourself or making sure that you know how to be a domestic partner with your partner. But you can't get stuck at that local frame and ignore the bigger frame that you're trying to contextualize it within.
Exactly. I think that's very well said.
Yeah.
I mean, so my concern as speaking sort of as a cognitive scientist which is the boot camp lesson. You know how you get people being really good at fighting? You put them into boot camp. That's why all the militaries have figured this out. That's what you do. The problem is, when we we basically make people sort of psychopaths in boot camp. Like, a lot of people will say when they're first out of boot camp, they're extremely dangerous. One person was telling me, he came out of boot camp and he was in his room and his mom walked in and he almost killed her.
Yeah.
He was visiting. Right. And so I don't know I don't know how to balance that. I mean, I don't know the theoretical argument about how to, because if we're really trying to get people to be prepared for violence, I don't know. Is there anything short of boot camp that we've got good reason to believe will work? Like you and I both know stories of the master in some effective martial art, and we've talked about it just a few minutes ago, that for other reasons was completely devastated by the psychological context of the situation. Right, because that's what boot camp works on, that level. It doesn't. I mean, they're training your physical skills, but you know what they're mostly doing? They're breaking you down as a person in a fundamental way. And you know, I don't know if we can generalize that as a pedagogical tool.
I think boot camp though isn't just about personal capacity for
it's collective
violence.
Too. Yeah,
it's really about creating a collective unit that can engage in violence. But even so, your point stands, right? I was just thinking about one of my favorite kind of thinkers about violence and how we can be capable of responding to it. Steve Morris, he talks a lot about the idea that negative affect actually drives preparation for violence.
Yes.
So he points to research that shows this, that if you are in an alert, alarmed state, you will have less of a sort of delay between the initiation of a potential ambush and your ability to respond to it. And you will respond with greater physical power and things like this. And his answer to that is be in it like close to a rage state as much as possible.
Yes.
But this to me looks like a great example of choosing to play the local game at a way that's going to make you much worse at the metagame.
Very, very, very much.
Right.
But I always found that scene in The Unforgiven chilling, right? What made him dangerous was not a skill.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't fast, right? He could, and he needed alcohol to do it, but he could turn on a switch and become a psychopath.
Yep.
He's just the cold-hearted killer, right? Which, by the way, doesn't contradict what you just said. He's this, right? And it's like,
well, alcohol has been a huge tool for that for militaries throughout history too.
Right. But pay attention to the title of the movie. The price he paid is he's the unforgiven. I don't want to be the unforgiven. I'm sure you don't.
No.
And so, like, yeah, for me, I'm sorry, I'm not being very helpful. I'm problematizing this, but this is how I think about this when I reflect on it. It's like, what is it I really want to be training here ultimately? And I get your point. How do I not delude myself about being able to handle self-defense? But how do I also because the thing about optimal grip is there's no set place, right? There's no algorithm where the optimal grip between the bottom up and the top down shifts according to the context.
Exactly. Yes. So the strategy that Steve is talking about is very appropriate for a soldier in the depths of the jungles of Vietnam during World War II. Yeah. It may be a necessary component of survival. But for myself, living with 3 small children and a wife and working in an environment where like my primary job with people is really to be loving towards them. Right. It's not, and the likelihood of me being assaulted in the small town that I live in the US is low. Right. So it's like, it would be a massive, I'm going to sacrifice some defensibility, right? Some ability to handle the scenario of actual lethal violence in order to not be a danger to myself and my family.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? It's kind of like, obviously don't want to get too deep into the gun debate, but this is this is right at the heart of the gun debate, which is, should you have the right to self-defense? Yes. Is it worth taking on, like, a lot of gun violence is incidental or self-harm,
or by family members,
and it's done in the heat of the moment, and
yes,
and so that the gun itself is a kind of accelerant of the potential for violence.
Yes.
So that's not to say that I'm against people owning guns, right?
I understand your point.
It is this optimal grip point, but you have to think about it I think it's a valuable way to think about it is the presence of the gun itself changes the constraint landscape in an important way.
Yes.
That inherently increases the potential for lethal violence to occur. So it may be worth it because of the deterrent effect that it has, or because of other cultural values or things that it gives to your life. But if you make that choice, you have to recognize how you've changed those constraints and work to proactively do them. It's the same thing. If you want to train yourself to be at a hair trigger to hurt somebody with your hands, then you need to also be training yourself to be really good at contextualizing when that's the appropriate, and how, like everyone who works with firearms you always treat a gun as if it's loaded.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
You never point a gun at somebody. Right. And so what is the equivalent for someone who's cultivating this extreme self-defense mindset? How did they have rituals and guardrails around that capacity they've built in themselves, so there isn't a misfire incident that badly hurt somebody? When Beth and I first got together, like, I was training martial arts all the time, and I elbowed her in the face in my sleep. Like,
yeah, I do in a previous marriage.
Yeah.
She's my ex-wife now, but she sort of jumped out at me from a bathroom. Like, like, there's this joke, and I had her on the ground without, and she was, oh, it's like, oh, should be doing that, right? Right. No, I get that. So for me, right, this goes back to the point I wanted to make, that I don't think there can be any deep separation between the cultivation of wisdom and the practice of the martial arts.
That's okay. I like that. That's a very interesting idea, because essentially what you're saying is that because of the nature of that specific task, it's like, okay, you can get really good at chess, and whether it has any impact on your wisdom is relatively irrelevant.
Yeah.
But when you're taking on something that has not just the potential to injure you, but injure anyone around you, it inherently has to be oriented. If it doesn't go to that higher order, then it's actually irresponsible.
Yeah. And it's also, like, given our previous point too, it could also be a significant waste of your time.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we were talking about positive transfer. Now we're talking about negative transfer.
Yeah.
Right. If you've trained yourself in such a way that you're going to respond to a surprise from your intimate partner with violence, you have trained yourself in a way that you've created a massive potential for negative impact, with a much lower potential of that actually having a positive impact in your life.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, yeah, thank you for recognizing it, because we sort of, in some sense, we built an argument I've been making for, right, why those two have to be wedded together, deeply wedded together. They have to be, there has to be sort of reciprocal reconstruction between the martial arts and the cultivation of wisdom. Yeah,
I actually think that there could be, we could do a series of talks about that, you and I, and also bringing in some other people from the martial arts community, because I think it's an extraordinarily deep topic. And I think it's been revelatory also of the central theme that we're talking about here, but I don't want the conversation to also collapse completely into that specific aspect of the martial arts, right?
Sure, of course.
I want to actually kind of go back to framing, even though we're an hour into this conversation, but I want to ask, what is mindfulness?
So, I mean, that even though there's a journal dedicated to its name and all of that, that's a controversial thing to ask, in that many people, myself included, are very critical of how it is typically defined or understood, like especially in the so-called West. And, I think mindfulness is how I would try to boil it down. So I don't like the feature list of, being present in a non-judgmental way, right? Like the sort of John Kabat said. He did a lot, and I don't.
I think you're fast forwarding that because you know that I'm aware of what you're saying. but remember that there's many people watching this.
So
what is the feature list that's generally given for mindfulness?
The idea is what it is to be mindful is to pay attention in the present moment in a non-judgmental fashion, and this will somehow make you more insightful, less reactive. That's a list of features, and that's a variation on a definition of mindfulness that John Kabat-Zinn made famous. Like I said, I'm hesitant to criticize him. I'm not criticizing him as a person or the mission he did for bringing Buddhism into the West and things like that. Those are different conversations. The problem that I've had with that, I wrote an article 2016, a book chapter with Leo Ferraro on reformulating the mindfulness construct. I have a chapter coming out in the philosophy of meditation, the Routledge Handbook, philosophy of meditation, edited by Rick Rapetti, where I've done more recent work. But the basic argument is that feature list is a very inadequate way of talking about mindfulness, precisely because it's a feature list. My standard example is if I tell you what a bird is, and I just say it has wings, feathers, and it flies, I just get a couple of wings and some feathers and throw them in the air. You don't have a bird, because the structural functional organization is missing. And then what you need to do is you need to ask causal and sort of constitutive questions. And you also need to do something else. Sorry, I'm trying to pack a lot into a little bit. You have to be careful to not directly take the language of how you train a skill into how you try to explain it, because the language of training and the language of explaining work according to very different parameters, very different goals, very different standards of good and bad. And if you just go from one to the other, you'll make all kinds of mistakes. And I can give people, if they want, lots of clear examples where the language of training.
I think I've talked about this a lot myself. So I mean, I'm sure there's some people who aren't completely trained, but if you go and you, like, I'll give you a really classic example. Telling people that they need to fire their glutes in order to jump effectively is extremely poor cueing. It is a accurate description of how jumping works, that the glutes are a prime mover in the jumping action, but it actually disrupts the skill. And similarly, some of the language that we use in coaching to describe how we want someone to do a skill is actually very inaccurate if you're trying to describe it at a physical level. So
Nick Wickelman's work, Nick's work is clear evidence of that. In his great book, The Language of Coaching, and some of the dialogues I've had with him and we've had together. So let's take it that's all. So what's happening with that is you get this feature list that doesn't capture the structural functional organization of the phenomena, which means it's already setting you to misunderstand the phenomena. And it's drawn almost without critique out of the language of training mindfulness into how we explain what mindfulness is. And so this is a very mistaken and misshapen. And then finally, what you get is you get a bunch of things, an ecology of practices, and you get it reduced to a single thing, meditation, for example. And then you also remove it from its overall like telos, which was, transformation of the individual, and you reduce it to making people contented with their position within corporate capitalism or something like that, right? And that's what the mindfulness critique is, right? What we've turned mindfulness. I mean, the Buddha was talking about something that was supposed to be, and I mean this, I don't mean this primarily politically, but he was talking about something that was supposed to be profoundly culturally revolutionary. And to get it to reduce to, well, I can do my job today. Like, that's not what's going on there. Okay. So I'm doing this very quickly. There's more extensive versions of these critiques. So I want to put away sort of a lot of standard models of what people think when they hear the word mindfulness and propose something different. That mindfulness is an awareness and an appropriation of your capacity for problem framing so that you have more cognitive flexibility within all of your cognitive framing, how you formulate all of your problems. That's what mindfulness ultimately is. It's a paying attention to framing so that you get the ability to intervene in it. Yeah.
That feels true, but I actually feel like it feels somewhat incomplete because it feels like that's almost propositional. Does that make sense? Because you're sort of like, what I'm hearing is it's a kind of training in metacognition, right? It's an ability to notice the frame that you're operating within. And I don't know, maybe I'm wrong here and tell me, but I feel like that that
No, you're right. If that's what you're getting, then I have been inadequate.
Okay.
I'm trying to point to a dynamic, right? I'm trying to, so it's not, that's why I was trying to capture this notion of not only awareness, but the ability to appropriate. That's why I use the metaphor of looking at my glasses, right? So, so this is my framing, right? I'm looking through and by means of, and in meditation, I step back and look at it in order to see how it might be distorting. In contemplation, I now see if I can see differently into the world, and each acts as a correction on the other. Like, it's because I might get a sense that as I'm looking out into the world that things are distorted, that I do this. But how do I know that any intervention I've done there is good? Well, I put my glasses back on and see if I can solve problems or see things that I couldn't see before. I'm talking about a dynamical system, right? That's what I was trying to convey with this notion of appropriate. I was trying to, that what you're doing is you're aware of it you're aware of your framing in your ability to break frame and make frame in a coordinated fashion that improves across multiple domains your optimal grip on the world. That's how I would put it.
Yes. Yeah. You said I highly recommend anyone who wants to dig deep into this, watch the episodes on mindfulness and insight in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. In one of those videos, you said that mindfulness is how we train attention to be systematically more capable of insight. Yes,
exactly. That's a good way of putting it. Yes.
And I think this gets right to the heart of like how, as a movement, well, there's two things that I want, right? I want to be able to say as a movement athlete, go to mindfulness and improve my abilities as a movement athlete. And then I also want to go to mindfulness and improve my ability to extract from my movement practice lessons that make me a better human outside of my mindfulness practice.
Wow, that's very well said. I like that. That was very well said.
Thank you. So we're engaging in this capacity to recognize the way they frame things. I've kind of evolved a specific ecology of mindfulness practices, which are interesting because I think they illustrate some of the core themes of what we do. And it wasn't intentional. It wasn't like I went out and selected these, but I found one and then found another. And then all of a sudden I just sort of started to do them. But I use essentially like a Vipassana practice, a concentration practice, where we either concentrate on the breath, concentrate on a point, or do both, right? And what I'm looking for is that ability to sink into this idea of the here and now, right? Which, like you talked about the fact that those are indexes that are really difficult to define. But I think one way to think about them is that we can look at them as scalar, right? We could say that, there's the here that I'm experiencing like in my body, or I could say the here that I'm experiencing between the tips of my fingers. Then there's the here that's this room. Then there's the here that's this house. And there's the here that's being in Bellingham, right? And it scales out, right? And then there's the now of like, I think that the human perception goes down to basically a very specific amount of time, right? There's a point at which we can't really differentiate more deeply than that. And then there's like the present as opposed to the past, which could be, 50 years ago.
Yep.
And what it feels like to me is that it's kind of like, how local can I get my attention? How much can I dial that attention into something very local? Which is an interesting thing for like, as an athlete, having your attention defray out from where it needs to be is a particularly problematic thing. Like, I think possibly because of my ADHD or whatever, that was a problem I had a lot when I first started training, and I would fall and hurt myself very frequently just because a thought would intrude on me during the performance of an act, or my attention would leap too early through a sequence. So I would be sort of saying, I need to do this step and then this step and then this step. And on that second step, my attention would already be too far to the third step. And that's when I would fault. Right. And so this ability to attune the attention in is really critical. So then we take that. So I look at a stillness practice, which is one way of thinking about this. Right? I'm moving between stillness and movement. But in the stillness aspect of my practice, I can really focus on what is happening at the layer of my attention and how powerfully can I localize it? And there's the sense that when I've really localized it for a period of time, there's almost a disappearance of the self into it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what I do is once I feel like I've gotten that, then I want to use it to first experience my body, to cultivate the internal awareness of my body so that I can better resolve any issues that are happening with the body. And then I do metta, right? I think about the relationships that are important to me and how I want to operate within them, right? May I be well, may I be at peace, may I love and be loved, right?
Yep.
And if I can, and I don't always do this one, but the other aspect of it is the sit spotting, which is turning my attention on the natural world. So I'm, in some sense, we're kind of moving through the 4 E's of cognitive science.
Yes. Yep. Yep.
Right. I am first just kind of engaging in the cognition and trying to become more adept at that. And then centering it into my body, and then centering it into the extended relationships that I have, and then into the world in which I'm embedded.
Your enacted embedment.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. I agree. You've of course recapitulated an ecology of practices or something very analogous that I was taught.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. And that goes towards the kind of, to loop it back, that goes towards the kind of degeneracy we were talking about earlier. Because these various dimensions of mindfulness, they shouldn't be practiced separately from each other.
Mm-hmm.
But neither should you try and find some homogeneity, just blob them together, if you'll allow me, right? Yeah. They simultaneously overlap and are differentiated from each other, and they dynamically constitute and constrain each other in a very powerful way. And that's exactly what I wanted to get at about a dynamic degeneracy, if people are hearing that correctly now, of attention, right? That's the kind of thing that, because what that does is it gives you this meta optimal grip. It gives you an optimal grip on your optimal gripping, which I think is the analog to the evolution of evolvability.
Okay. So I wanted to, that's a good one. It's a analog to the evolution of evolvability. It's a way of cultivating evolvability within yourself. Exactly. Which is actually I think that's at the heart of solving the meta crisis, right? Because what we have is a problem that the environment is shifting at a rate that is higher than has ever been in the past. Yeah. And so the capacity to extract out those higher order insights that allow us to effectively organize human life towards the good become less and less obvious because the local circumstances are more and more variable.
Exactly. And I mean, there's been a sequence of dialogues, particularly with Jordan Hall and I, around this theme. Exactly. Yeah. This is the point. And this is part of, it's a loving critique. And I just had a great discussion with Paul Van de Clay and Paul Antletter. But this is part of my critique of what, and I know you push back on me on this, but that's the core of the critique. My concern, I guess is a better way of putting it, about whether or not the existing world religions have the right genetic code in order to meet the current challenge. That is at the core of my concern. I know there's a counterbalance.
Well, I think that your concern can be true and my critique can both be true.
I was just about to say, I was just about to say that they're not exclusive of each other. And I often say that I do not have a foreclosure argument against the world religions. I don't, but I do have a concern, and I'm expressing that's the concern.
And I think I have the same concern. And I want to maybe we'll have a chance to come back to that, or maybe we'll have to pick that up again. But I wanted to go back for a second too. I want to talk a little bit about the ecological dynamics idea and how it attunes to this, because they talk about skillfulness is not a program that is cultivated in the mind, right? Rather, it's a way in which we educate attention, intention, and calibration of action.
Yeah.
And I think this really aligns with what you're talking about in a deep and important way, right? And you talked about the metaphor, Siddhartha's like, you're talking about in your discussion of Buddhism, the middle way was described as tuning the instrument correctly.
Yes. Yes.
Neither too tight nor too loose.
Yes. Yes.
And I think there's something really deep about that because it's not just that there's too tight and too loose, right? It's that when the thing is tuned correctly, it comes into harmony and there's emergent capacity within it.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And so I'm struggling to some degree with some of the aspects of the ecological dynamics or ecological psychology and how I think there's something, it's grounding out in a philosophical position that's Heideggerian that I'm not sure that I can fully like. That I think there's something missing there, but I don't know that I understand it completely yet. But I think that's key. And I wanted to go back again to this. The central idea is, how can we utilize these tools so it's better to improve within our practice and use our practice to improve within life? And so, where did I want to go with this? Insight, right? You also conceptualize flow as an insight cascade.
Very much.
Right.
And
so
mystical experiences is kind of hyperflow and etc.
Yeah.
The cognitive continuum proposal. Yes, very much.
So flow is a form of insight cognition. And we know that the meditation systematically improves our capacity for insight. And we know also that it improves our capacity for flow.
Very much. Very much.
Then that if we can access that within our physical practice, we know that it will improve us, right? But also, if we can scaffold up the embodied aspect of who we are, such that we have access to it in a way that informs that insight capacity, I believe that's actually central to becoming truly virtuous people. That going up to that higher order principle, we have to have that bottom up, top down interaction.
I totally agree. I think that's exactly right. That's why I've been using this paired phrase, virtue and virtuosity, as a way of trying to capture the two together. Exactly. I think that's right. And that virtual engineering, which brings in the third, right? The virtue, virtuality, and virtuosity are all interwoven. Because I would say, in addition to attentional practices, there are imaginal practices we have to engage in that are also have this capacity to afford, getting us the right flow from the bottom up and the top down.
Yeah, that's kind of the next set of questions that I have, which we don't have time to serve all of them, but I wanted to just review some of the ground that we went over because I think it's profound. So when I train one skill, I learn something that allows me to attune my attention, intention and calibration in that skill. When I learn multiple skills, I start to extract out higher order principles that can help me. Yeah. So now what I experience as an athlete moving into a new domain is that it's still a struggle initially, but I have an access to a more rapid series of insights that give me control of that skill more rapidly.
Yep, that sounds plausible. Yep.
Right. So then what I've seen happen is that those insights that I'm experiencing physically show up in life, in social relational. We can like you talked about, I did Tai Chi and people noticed I was a different human being. So you had a physical practice that had a transfer at a social relational level.
Totally. And cognitive.
Yeah. And my wife just talked about, she's having the exact same experience right now relative to rock climbing. Yep. I've had, one of the women, we talk about her experience a lot. She did this jump. She asked if she could cry while she was jumping. I said, yes. And it changed her whole sort of perception of how you take on challenge. And then she felt like she could go back to that experience of having jumped. And it wasn't just that she did the jump. It It was the emotional context of the jump and what it resolved that gave her this insight that she was then able to apply to her life repeatedly to navigate problems at the interpersonal and business level. So we know that can happen, and we also know that it doesn't always happen. So if what mindfulness is a system to cultivate the capacity for that insight generation, if we can put it in relationship to those physical practices, that should give us a better virtual engine for becoming more capable of those insights.
Yeah, I think that's totally right.
Okay.
And you, I mean, you've already got the overlap that affords adaptation, because when people are in seated meditation, the cerebellum is highly active, which is paradoxical given that you're not moving, right? And so you're already driving some of the machinery that you're going to be using on both of those, right? Because the cerebellum doesn't care if it's coordinating sensory motor or if it's connecting Heidegger to Merleau-Ponty. It doesn't, right? It doesn't care about how you're mapping complex contingencies. So yes.
Getting into the cerebellar loop and some sort of these like neural and deep cognitive structures and how they relate to this, that'd be a really fascinating place to get deep. But I did want to touch briefly on the spirituality aspect of this and the sort of the meta crisis, because we've touched on it a little bit.
Multiple times. That's what I most care about right now.
Yeah. Good. Because as I was thinking about, as I was writing up my questions for this, one of my questions is how is, and so I'm going to give you multiple questions, so don't jump right away, but how is meditation different from prayer? That was the first question. The second question to occur to me as I was doing this is, the first place that the Eastern meditative traditions go is attention to the breath. To a modern Western mind, that's a purely physical thing. But in almost every previous cosmological worldview, breath is spirit.
Yes, very much.
It's inspiration. It's the pneuma. It's like there's so many terms that have to do with the way that we think about essence. This is breath too, right? So if you're a Buddhist or a Taoist and you're doing seated meditation, or you're a Vedanta, right? And you're doing seated meditation and you're attending to breath, you're attending to spirit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But when it's extracted and brought to the West, we can conceptualize, we can frame mindfulness in this way that ignores those resonances of spiritual meaning to the physical acts of how we do this.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious to have you address those questions. I mean, I don't know if I framed it as a question well, but
no, I can take it as a question. It's fine. Let's do the second one first, which is, there's a danger of physiological reductionism. Totally. Mm-hmm. And we keep doing this with everything. We basically did that to yoga. It's physiological reductionism. So following the breath, right? Think about where the breath sits phenomenologically, functionally for you. It sits on the border between the voluntary and the involuntary. It sits on the border between the inner world and the outer world. It sits on the border between life and death for you. The point of following the breath is to situate yourself on that cuspal point, not just to track the inflow of a certain number of gases into your abdomen and then the exhalation. The point is to situate yourself, right, where the breath is as a phenomenological functional thing for you. You have to get back into what you have to recover the exactive potential of the breath, right? It can be exacted like I just did. See how I can think about the voluntary and the involuntary. I can think about the inner and the outer. I can think about the border between life and death, right? Because the pause feels like death, and then the fullness of life there's all this stuff that's going on in the breath, and so there was reason why spiritus means, right, right? And think also the wind. And you know, who has seen The Wind, a famous Canadian novel? The wind moves itself, right? And you move yourself. There's that, like, you have to appreciate, you have to appreciate the phenomenological functional range of the phenomena, not just its physiological presence to you. Like, but the point is that skill generalizes, because we like, do you see what I'm saying? See, notice I'm taking sight and using it. Well, go back and unpack that, open that up. Like, all of these things can be, I do that often in the series. Go back and open it up, right? And resist, right? Resist the trivialization and reductionism that our culture is guilty of. So that's how I would answer the second thing. Like, you should be, don't follow the breath as just a physiological phenomena, because that's not all it is for you. Recover everything that it is for you. Like, really, almost like you're sit-seeing, like, really situate yourself in the phenomenological functional web of the breath. Don't just follow it physiologically. Now, that doesn't mean that you're doing philosophy when you're doing that. Do what we did here. Really sensitize yourself to the web, and then here's this sounds like a Zen koan, and then just follow the breath. It's like, activate all of that, so it's there, right? It's there, but all you're doing is following the breath. But all of that will impregnate your awareness of the breath as it wants to. I don't know if that answered the second question.
I think it was a beautiful exploration, right? I think it wasn't maybe the answer to the question that I had, but it was an answer to something that was happening within the question, right? Which is that, what is it to focus on the breath?
Yes.
And how does the culture that we're in actually narrow what that means in a way that dilute us to the meaning of these practices that we are adopting? I'm trying to call forth the argument that David Abram makes in the final chapter of The Spell of the Sensuous, which is called I think it's called The Forgetting and Remembering of Air. And it's all about this theme that breath was sacred, that breath was conceived as continuous with wind, which was conceived as continuous with spirit, right? Yes. And he talks about this. He gives the example of the Navajo and their idea of the different winds that come together and make a human soul when the child is conceived. And also in the Jewish tradition, he talks a lot about the idea of what happened when we invented vowels, and that before, the vowel was the wind. Right? And it was the representative of the spirit that made the text alive, and you had to read it, and you had to know how to read it in order to bring it to life. And so there's something, and I agree with you that I think of the breath as it's liminal, or it's the twilight, right? It's the point between the conscious and the unconscious. And I've used my breath to track myself down into my heartbeat and learning to actually have some control of my heartbeat. It's very minimal, but you can do that. And then looking at my digestive system, but it's like, can you start to feel that, right? And this is the idea of like inner alchemy. Can you change things that aren't conscious? Mm-hmm. And fundamentally, one of the big things that I think about with my work as I'm trying to describe it to people is this idea of the integration of the aspects of the self in a much more complete way, right? We are not just a set of thoughts in a brain, right?
Yes, that's right.
Right. We need to, I struggle with this because it's like, you can't separate the mind and the body. And yet we have to conceptually see them as diverged in some sense in order to see how we intentionally integrate them. Right? This is your idea of complexification. It's like we can see the systems as in some sense separated, but then also only having meaning in some sense, only having function in their integration. And then that integration of the mind, body, environment, and tribe.
Yeah.
Right. That's what people need in order to have that experience of meaning in life.
I agree with all of that. There's two things I want to say. One in reply to that, and then to answer the first question you posed, which is, that's like at the core of participatory knowing, really wrestling with, and I mean it phenomenologically, functionally, not just conceptually, but not excluding the conceptual either, right? Really wrestling with mind body trains you in a transferable skill, because that's also the relationship between the past and the present. You can't reduce one to the other, but they're not separable from each other in any way, right? And there's the transcendent and the immanent, eternity and time. Like when you and I mean this profoundly, you are an constantly enacted symbol that is there, pregnant with, an education, a way of scaffolding you to grapple with some of the big questions of reality. And so you're practicing that, like you just did in a mindfulness practice. You're practicing tapping into that exaptive potential of the body as a living symbol that allows you, I'm almost sounding like the Hermetic tradition now, but allows you, like the microcosm to the macrocosm. Part of mindfulness is to awaken that from from being an inert potential to an actual potential for you. That gets me back to the first question, which is, what's the difference between meditation and prayer? And I would say they display degeneracy with respect to each other. They overlap, but they're different. And the way, because there's places where they're indistinguishable. So when you're getting the centering prayer, and many people would in the Christian meditation tradition would agree with this, you're doing something that is pretty much like meditation. And then when you're going up to something like petitionary prayer, you're very, very far from it. And what I would propose you're varying in there, and you also do this in meditation. Like, I'm in meditation, or especially in contemplation, the degree to which I involve the imaginal. So as the imaginal starts to take more and more center stage, I would say you're shifting from mindfulness, meditation, contemplation into prayer. But but they overlap. Like, so when you're doing the view from above, you're doing the imaginal in a very powerful way. And that's nevertheless, right, still seen as a mindfulness practice. So, and if you read, so this is overly simplified, but like when you read the great Christian thinkers about prayer, it sort of comes down to this. The only thing you should really pray for is wisdom. That's the only petitionary prayer. And then that becomes kind of indistinguishable from, imaginal contemplation. So when I'm doing the view from above, okay, that doesn't feel like prayer because it's not dialogical, but there's contemplative practices that are dialogical. So when Antisthenes said he learned from Socrates how to talk to himself, well, he's internalized Socrates, and he's doing this imaginal inner dialogue. Is that prayer? Is that meditation? And I don't know if much hangs on like trying to keep them cleanly distinct. I think they do this with respect to each other. Now, do I think I turn prayer into a kind of idolatrous behavior? Yeah. Like, and Lerman talks about this beautifully in How God Becomes Real. She says, there's different kinds of real. There's real, causal real, and then there's this other real that is basically the imaginal real. And she says, I talk to Christian fundamentalists and they'll say Jesus is real, but you're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to say, well, I won't do my homework, I'll let Jesus do it, right? right. And I mean no insult to Christians here. The point is, right, there's like the imaginal can get confused with the causal, but if you pay very careful attention to even people who are in what they do and how they practice, not what they say, you'll notice that they are actually they're trying not to conflate these two together. So to my mind, the danger of prayer that isn't a danger in meditation, I'll talk about the dangers in meditation in a second, right? The danger in prayer is to confuse the imaginal with the causal. And that I think is a very significant danger. Now, there's a counterbalancing danger within meditation, which the Buddha warned against, which is there's spiritual bypassing. There's a kind of contentedness, and this is part of the mindfulness critique too. There's a contentedness with oneself that is actually the worst possible bullshit for preventing you from the growth that you need to undertake. And I mean, and this is becoming a serious phenomena. One of the negative side effects of the mindfulness revolution and the New Age movement and related things, and psychologists are now studying this as a bona fide phenomena, is spiritual bypassing, which is what I do is I go in and I have these wonderful experiences, and this is so pertinent to what we've all been you and I've been talking about throughout all of this, and they don't transfer. In fact, they do the opposite. They delude me into believing I don't need to consider that transfer. I don't need to be involved with that worldly thing or that materialistic thing or that or that or that or that. And Neoplatonism was guilty of this too, right? Mm-hmm. Porphyry began his biography of Plotinus with this, and this always terrifies me. Plotinus behaved like a man who was ashamed of having a body. And it's like, whoa, I don't want to be that person ever, right? Yeah. And so, right, what I wanted to be balanced in the critique. Prayer has its idolatry, if you'll allow me a biblical term, and meditation has its as well. Spiritual bypassing is just, I meet so many people who, and all they want to do is tell me of their wonderful experience and why they don't need to do philosophy and why they don't need to read books and why they don't need to cultivate virtue because they're enlightened. They're enlightened, and don't you just know it? Don't you just know it? And it's like, probably not. I've met one or two people in my life who I might say were enlightened, and I haven't seen good evidence for this being a general thing. And so, spiritual bypassing is also a very important deal. This is why what you do is so important.
Thank you.
There's no spiritual bypassing allowed in Evolve, Move, Play. It's not going to find a home there. It's not going to find a home there.
No, a big part of my formation is my, having been absorbed and grown up in the counterculture and then having rejected it. And one of the moments what I remember feeling the most sort of sense of like, I'm so not this and I'm so against it was either 19 or 20. And I was sitting in a sauna with some other kids who'd grown up in the hippie community, and I was talking to them. I was passionate about the politics of the time, about the Iraq war or the wars that were about to happen and the environmental crisis. And these kids were like, it doesn't matter, man. We're all going to vibrate to the next dimension. We just need to evolve higher consciousness. And I was like, no. And and I've seen that thing so many times. Like, that's why I've been so hesitant about the use of the word spirituality, because we're just going to manifest this, right? And it's so non-virtuous to me, right?
Yes.
So lazy, and it's so narcissistic. And so that we can have another. I mean, that'd be a whole another long conversation. So I wanted to. I will say one thing which I think is interesting. So idolatry, you threw that word out there, and that's been happening in a lot of your conversations, and I think it's a really good one. I don't know that my audience has that impact, but it's the worship of the proximal thing when you should be oriented towards the absolute, right?
Yes.
So if we go back to the example that we talked about earlier of like, you decide to take on self-defense. You don't decide to take on self-defense maybe just because you want self-defense maybe because you want to feel secure, and you want self-defense because you want to be able to protect your family, and you want self-defense for all these other reasons because it's going to help you grow as a human being. But then you go into self-defense and it becomes so big in your mind that it's the thing that you worship, and then you start to make sacrifices to it. That are hurting the things that you're actually trying to serve. And we can do this with any number of practices. And so this is the real question, I think, is like, this is where it gets interesting, is how do we, in some sense, like, you have to worship self-defense.
Yeah.
Right? But if you let it be the highest thing that you worship, then you're not actually serving the reason you showed up in the first place. And it's a bad God, right? It's a bad God. Self-defense is a bad God. Parkour, I would say, is a bad God. It's a good pathway towards seeing a higher God. But if you stop there, then it's not serving you. And I think this idea of idolatry as that is really, really powerful.
It is. And I think it was, I might be misattributing it, but I think it was David Hume who said, nobody chooses, and this is a Platonic point, nobody chooses to do evil. They choose a lesser good over a greater good.
Yes, exactly. Wow. That's a beautiful idea. So what you should be in the relationship of worship too, that's maybe the most important question, right? Because it's what organizes your action towards the good. So you were talking about the imaginal, right? Once we access the imaginal, we're in some sense starting to move into prayer. And I thought about this because I think after I watched your thing on agape and, I got into that, there was a point at which I was doing my meta meditation. At the end, I just played with this idea of like, may I love the world as Christ loved the world. Right. It's like, can I imagine this person and the sacrifice they made and this narrative power?
Yeah.
And can I try to reflect it as much as possible?
Yes.
And of course, like right away, there's a problem there, which you see all the time, is people conflate themselves with the object of worship.
Of course. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's not like I've done that a ton, and my relationship with Christianity is still sort of probably fuzzy in a way that makes some people uncomfortable. But it's profound to me,
which I think should be respected as well.
What's that?
And tender. One of the things you and I share is we've been hurt by religious formations in the past, and we're careful around them. There's that. And
yes.
I just wanted to acknowledge that in you, so other people would also pay proper attention to that when they're talking to you.
Sure. So I wanted to share that, I guess, as just a.
Well, can I ask you something? Can I ask you something about just that? So for me, the imaginal would be if you did that, and then when you open your eyes, it augments reality for you in a certain way. You start to see things in your actions towards others that you couldn't have seen without having done that imagistic practice. Like if the imagery affords ontological depth perception, that's when it's properly imaginal.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure that I can disaggregate the effects of like the physical practices and the mindfulness practices with the images. I mean, it's impacting the way that I see the world for sure in profound ways, right?
For me, for example, let me make it a little bit more specific. It's hard to know how you would engage the perspectival transformation needed for agape without doing that kind of imaginal practice.
Yeah.
And then the thing is, but you don't want to measure it just from the inside. Well, I did it. You have to say, like, other people noticing me transform. Like when I did this, did I see things? And more importantly, did people see me differently? And
certainly I've had.
That's the imaginal. That's the imaginal.
Yeah.
When, if you'll allow me, that's when your prayers are being answered.
There we go. Yeah, I've had that acknowledgement, right, from students like, you are a different person than I remember 5 years ago, and this new version is stronger and more admirable and more virtuous, and mostly more loving.
There you go. There you go.
And that's maybe that's the best thing to be.
Well, wise loving.
I think
that's the one thing. If I could add one thing I would do better in my life is like if I could love more wisely. That would be it. That would be it.
Precisely. So, we're gonna end the live streams here soon. But is there any last words you'd like to share with people watching on the live stream?
This was a lot of. It's to me what we did was actually what I call philosophia, right? It's not academic philosophy, but this what we did together dialogically, and how we're willing to move, zoom out, zoom in, move between levels, try to bridge across domains, all guided by this, sort of central following the logos, probing to get to the depths of something. That's what I mean by philosophia. I don't mean sitting around just talking about concept. This. And for me, this practice has got to be part of any ecology of practices that are being proposed for responding to the meaning crisis. That would be my final thing I'd want to say.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I was thinking about the idea, like, I'm not sure actually how many times you and I have spoken on my channel and your channel at this point. And it's like, for most podcasts, like once you've had a guest on, they're kind of like, you've had that guest on. You might have them on a couple of years later when they release a new book or something. Yeah. And I was thinking about that as I was preparing for this, and like wanting to feel prepared enough that we could generate something of real value for people. But I think we're getting better at talking to each other, right? Like we're accessing dialogos more profoundly as we get more chances to speak to each other, which is a really cool thing to feel like it's cultivating things, and really
it's philia.
Yeah.
That's how friendship works. It's exactly like how friendship works. To remember that that's at the core of it. How did I met this guy and he was my friend and I don't need to see him again. Is that how friendship works? No, that's not how it works. It's not how it works.
Yeah. So wonderful. Thank you so much, John. So Robert, go ahead and end the live stream. And